Thanks, Barry, and thanks to Lois Woodham and to Ollie for this opportunity. This past Friday, uh, February the 12th, was the 48th year since I was the lead Air Force physician on the C-141s flying American POWs out of Hanoi on the first day of their release in an operation the military called Operation Homecoming. Today, I'm going to go over basically what the POWs went through, and then talk about something of the experiences the wives had, which they had their own series of travails while the men were away. And then I'll talk about the actual operation of bringing the men home. We'll have a break and then time for questions and answers. Next week, I'll spend more time on the issue of the wives. They had some unique problems, which we'll talk about as we go. So very briefly, I got through medical school and my internship and emerged from that with no interest in anything I had seen so far medically. It was kind of demoralizing that I hadn't fallen in love with some aspect of medicine, but I just wasn't very intrigued. At the time, there was an obligation to go into the military if you wanted to avoid being drafted out of your medical school training. So I opted to go into the Air Force. And I signed up to be a flight surgeon, not knowing what the heck that was, but it paid $150 a month more. So after my medical school training, demoralized as I went off to my first assignment, which was Nellis Air Force Base in Las Vegas, seemingly out in the middle of the desert there. What I found out there with my experience was that being a flight surgeon, you're the family doctor for the pilots in your squadron and their families. I had two squadrons, and one of them was the fighter weapons school, which is where if you're a fighter pilot, you go to target practice. If you're flying a machine like this and you've got all sorts of machine guns and bombs and things, you have to be good at what you do and know where your bullets are going and bombs are going. And the big Nevada desert was a big gunnery range for the fighter weapons school. In my wildest dreams going through medical school, it never occurred to the old risk-averse me was going to be flying around the sky in something like this thing. But that's what I was doing. That's part of my duty. My other squadron was the Thunderbirds. And this is a many years old video of the plane they were flying back then, which is the F-100. And I actually flew in the two-seat version of this sometimes, and they flew me through the show routine. Bottom line was that I was very interested in occupational medicine, with aviation being the occupation, based on my experience at Nellis. And I really liked working with the pilot population, so I requested a tour of duty in Germany. Had an equally pleasant experience there. So I applied for residency training in aerospace medicine. Aerospace medicine is a subset of occupational medicine. The first year of the Air Force training program involves getting a master's degree. I went to Johns Hopkins in Baltimore to get the master's degree, and then back to the School of Aerospace Medicine for years 2 and 3 of the residency program. Because at Nellis I developed a knack for counseling, it was known to the surgeon's office that I was interested in psychiatry. So they asked me if I'd review the medical records of the Air Force prisoners of war, which I did. And that got me intrigued in the concept of what prisoners of war go through. So I began reading the medical literature from prior wars and talking to POWs who had been in prior wars, and discovered that the Navy had set up a center for studying POWs just very recently. I got there in 1970 and they set up in 1971. But basically, I soon knew more than anybody else in the Air Force about prisoners of war and evolved as the Air Force expert on prisoners of war and their problems, and got involved with all the planning, medical planning for the return of the POWs. One of the, this is sort of a historical perspective of POWs going way back to the Civil War. You can see that the numbers there, prisoners held in the North were quite high, in the South. World War II, not too many. Prisoners in World War II in Europe were pretty large number, but they were only there less than a year. If you were a prisoner of the Japanese, you were there for 3 years. The red bar at the bottom is the number of people who died when they were prisoners, percentage-wise. In World War II and in Korea, the death rate, if you're a prisoner of the Asians, was up around 30 or more %. You can see there are not too many POWs out here in Vietnam, and it's too small to see the death rate, but it was pretty high. The other thing that was dramatic to me from the start in my reading was that the POWs from all prior wars were very different from the men that were POWs in Vietnam. In prior wars, the average age was 18 to 24. They were not married, only a high school education. Most were drafted. There was almost no selection criteria. They were enlisted men mostly with no survival training. The POWs in Vietnam, conversely, average age was 30. They were married. Most were college graduates. They were volunteers. Highly selected population. They were officers, and many had survival training. I call these factoids, a little less documentation as to why these things are true. But there are studies that show that pilots are very intelligent, but, quote, their interests are generally not intellectual, unquote. Fighter pilots frequently have a compulsive personality style. They're often firstborn and have a strong connection to the father, which makes them very similar to the first wave of astronauts. They shared these characteristics. And from a book that I'm about to tell you about, they were generally male chauvinists. It takes 2.5 years to train a pilot, $9 million to get them up to speed with fighter pilots, and the cost of the aircraft is around $80 million. So looking a bit more in detail at the people who were returned during Operation Homecoming, who were held in the North, most of them were Air Force. A smaller percentage were Navy. 80% of them were aviators. The Army, 77% were generally enlisted people who were held in the South, but they came back during Operation Homecoming. And I won't be talking about the people held in the South. I'll be talking about mostly this population here. Within this population, there are subgroups. 2/3 of these men were prisoners an average of 6 years or more. Then there was a bombing halt, following which there was an 11-day bombing blitz in December '72, and 1/3 of the prisoners in this group have an average captivity of 6 weeks or less. So their captivity experience was vastly different from the 2/3 that were there for 6 years or more. And again, I won't be talking about them so much because it was quite different. When I do talk about wives, I'm going to lean heavily on this wonderful new book by Heath Hardage Lee, who meticulously documented and described the things the wives were going through while their husbands were prisoners. I was involved with the men and not with the wives, but I got plenty of information secondhand from social workers working with the wives and from a variety of sources. But a lot of my information will come from this book. So I've talked about what the men were like. Wives of military pilots in the 60s were more socially conservative. They were a little slow to see the merits of women's liberation. They were quite accepting of the role of supporting their husband and fitting in with the needs of his career. There were, interestingly, official wives' handbooks, officer wives' handbooks that went into great detail about their role as supporting the husband, the social roles. When you put on white gloves and went and left calling cards on the silver trays in the officers' quarters for when you visited the wife of the senior officer in your husband's squadron. There was also kind of a warning that they were to keep a quiet household. One such handbook warned that family discord was a greater cause of fatal accidents than was combat, which kind of put the onus on the wives to keep a lid on it and raise the children and run a quiet household. Because the husbands were in high risk profession, the wives tended to bond together. The Thunderbird wives, for example, went to church together and socialized together. And as the book commented in one place, several wives said they were raised to be second-class citizens and just be second banana to their husband's career. Well, how does one get to be a POW? You get orders to Vietnam, obviously, but the men frequently volunteered. Frequently covertly. They didn't tell their wives they were volunteering. They said, "Oh, geez, dear, I'm sorry, I got orders to Vietnam." But basically, if you're trained as a fighter pilot, you want to go demonstrate what you know. You then went through survival training, which I'll talk about in a minute. You go through the fighter weapons school to learn how to shoot and bomb. And then you proceed to Vietnam, you get shot down. The survival training raised one particular problem for the POWs. Where am I here? And that was a product of the Korean War. The Korean POWs were a disorganized group, mostly enlisted, and they were tortured and signed anti-war documents and basically behaved in ways that American society felt was subpar. So a code of conduct was developed specifying how you should behave if you are a POW. The one that I'm going to highlight here is that you're obligated to give name, rank, service number, and date of birth, but you will evade any answers beyond that. And that was to avoid what was perceived at the time as sneaky Asian brainwashing techniques, where they would start by asking you simple problems like, what does your father do and how much money does he make? But eventually, when you became comfortable answering simple questions, they would ask you how the atomic bomb was designed, and you would blurt it out. We'll talk more when I get to the prison experience about how that, they called it the Big Four, name, rank, service number, and date of birth, how that became a problem. So you're fully trained, you're over in Vietnam, and you're in an airplane, you get shot down. How the heck do you get from being in an airplane going 500 miles an hour to being on the ground? It's worth taking a minute to consider how that happens. It happens because you're sitting on an ejection seat which shoots you out of the aircraft fast enough so that the tail section coming along at you at 500 miles an hour doesn't whack you. A lot of things happen at very quick succession. You pull the handles up on your seat, the canopy blows off, the rocket in the seat you're sitting on shoots you out of the airplane. Once you're out, you don't want to be in that seat anymore. So a canvas strap that you've been sitting on reels taut and flings you out of the seat. This is known in the trade as the butt snapper. To keep you from spinning around in the air, a drogue chute deploys, which stabilizes you and also pulls out your main chute so that you can float gently to the ground. Let's take a look at what that looks like in real time. Canopy blows, seat ejects, butt snapper, seat separation, drogue chute, main chute. And I think he dropped his coffee cup there. One of the things that happens when you hit the air at 500 miles an hour is that your arms and legs flail. And there's a high incidence, or used to be back in this era, of broken arms and legs and dislocated limbs from the ejection process. Let's take a look at that one more time. Canopy goes, seat ejects, seat separation, drogue chute, main chute, and coffee cup. So the problem if you injure several limbs is that when you come in contact with the ground, you may not be able to land gracefully, and there's an additional risk of fractures and parachute landing on the ground. But let's take an example. This fellow landed pretty safely. 5 minutes ago, he was in full command of the universe in an $80 million aircraft. And now his life is in danger from an old Vietnamese holding a hoe. That's one scenario. This is another scenario. This is John McCain, who ejected upside down at 500 miles an hour over downtown Hanoi and landed in the lake in the middle of Hanoi. And he's being hauled out of the water at the time. In the process of ejection, he broke his right arm in 2 places and broke his leg above the knee. The pilots themselves say that the closer you ejected to Hanoi, the more likely you were to survive the experience. The Hanoi Hilton is a downtown prison known as Hoa Lo to the Vietnamese, which means fiery furnace. But at least you were indoors if you got taken to the Hanoi Hilton, and there was medical treatment available. The men do point out that despite all the extreme injuries to the limbs, nobody came back that was an amputee. So there was undoubtedly a lot of people who didn't get treated or whose treatment was insufficient. This is John McCain after having had his arm put in about 50 pounds of plaster. So the treatment wasn't wonderful, but at least you were indoors, not exposed to the elements. If you ejected somewhere south of Hanoi, you might end up in a tiger cage in the jungle. This was less wonderful. This is a big one with several men in it. This is a smaller one, more personal size. But the Viet Cong had to move frequently. And if you couldn't move with them because of your injuries, they frequently, you would not survive the experience. You're also exposed to the insects and malaria much more so than if you were a prisoner in the north. So once in the camp, let's see, where am I? Yeah. Once in the camp, the first thing that became obvious is that the Geneva Convention protections were not going to apply. The Vietnamese North Vietnamese communists considered that the American attack on Vietnam was illegal and that the pilots were war criminals. A list of names of POWs being held as required by the Geneva Convention was never provided, not even up to the last day. Humane treatment was never provided. Adequate diet was not provided. No visits from the Red Cross were allowed. No comfort items from the Red Cross were permitted. And the communication from family was very iffy, frequently not allowed. They would let letters through if it contained bad news or something demoralizing. So there you are in the camp. It's obvious the Vietnamese are not fond of you. And so the experience begins. From 1964 to October 69, and we'll talk about that date later, torture was frequent for a variety of reasons. If you were resisting whatever they were doing, you'd be tortured. They would use it to disrupt command and control. Any attempt to assign a senior officer who would give orders. they'd use it to extract propaganda and to divulge military information. This is a sketch done by one of the POWs, and it was called the ropes. It was one of the most dreaded of the tortures. They tie your arms tightly behind your back, wrench your arms up over your head until your shoulder is dislocated, and leave you in that position for hours and hours and hours. Did torture work? It sure did. Jim Stockdale said that after 15 minutes, he would have shot his mother. And one POW told me, you just don't know what it's like to lose control of your bowels when you hear the keys of the prison guard coming down the hallway. It was that brutal. And this was only one variation of the various kinds of things that happened. The thing that the men experienced at their first torture episode was that they would definitely go beyond the big four: name, rank, serial number, and date of birth. And a lot of the men considered that a hallmark of their John Wayne approach to being a prisoner. They assumed they'd resist, and they rapidly found out it was just not possible to resist. So they felt what they called broken. And they thought, well, you know, I'm disloyal, I dishonored myself, and I'm ruined. So there was sort of a black and white sense to their ability to resist torture that was very demoralizing. And they had to learn that everybody can be broken no matter what you thought about yourself, and you were not John Wayne no matter how much you wanted that to be true. Other than torture, if we had brought them back prior to October 69, the men would have looked like this. They had many nutritional deficiencies. They had watery boiled weeds, they called it, with chunks of pig in it. And these were chunks that included the hide and the bristles and the fat below. It had almost no nutritional value, but they ate it anyway because there wasn't anything else. One fellow said he figured he'd eaten the equivalent of 1,000 footballs while he was there. And then there are all the other things that might kill you. Many of the men came back with malaria that we had to treat. Dysentery. It was normally a problem more in the South. And if it was untreated, it would kill you. It causes just watery diarrhea to the point that you die. A lot of them had intestinal parasites, and infected wounds were a problem. Then there was the issue of solitary confinement or isolation, and the two are different. This is a cell block, and if you're in a cell next to another guy, that you were isolated. You were not allowed to communicate in a way that the guards could detect, and for which you would be punished. But that was isolation, but not solitary confinement. Solitary confinement was if you're moved to a 3 by 9 foot concrete cell, shackled to the bed every night. You're not able to move. Robbie Reisner, one of the senior officers, was in solitary confinement for 3 years, Stockdale for 4 years. And this was one of the most psychologically damaging things that the POW said could happen to them. Communication. Okay, so if you're next door to somebody and you want to be sneaky and communicate, you can't use Morse code because you can't tell a dot from a dash if you're tapping on a wall. So this is what was known as the tap code. It's a 5 by 5 table with C equals K, and you would tap the row and then the column number. And you'd initiate the tapping by shave and a haircut. And if the person next door was able at that point to communicate, he'd answer. And then you'd start with the communication. They became incredibly facile with this and variations of it. If there was a person out in the courtyard sweeping, they would sweep one way for a row and the other way for a column so that people looking out the window could pick up messages. If the guards tortured out of you what the code was, which they soon did, you could encrypt it by saying, we're going to slide the columns one to the right on Tuesday. So there was this technique during the early part of the prison experience that was used between prisoners. Communicating with the wife, the men tried all kinds of clever ways of wording letters that would embed information in them that the wife would pick up on. So the wives always turned over the letters to the intelligence, Navy intelligence or Air Force intelligence to analyze for covert messages. And after a while, the intelligence service started working with some of the wives, and we'll talk about that, to transmit covert information back to the POWs. And they would tell the wife how to encode the messages that they wanted sent. It could be something like the first letter of every third line will represent a word and a message. And somehow the man in the prison would have to figure out that was going on. But it got more sophisticated. For example, the CIA would disassemble a Polaroid photograph, put in a transfer paper that if you write through the transfer paper onto the margins of a letter, it would transfer an invisible message. So to get the transfer paper to the POW, they would disassemble a Polaroid picture, put the transfer paper in between the pieces, glue it back together again, and then the POW would have to be communicated with, and he had to soak that in water or something to get the transfer paper and then use it. So there was communication possible, but boy, it was laborious. Okay, we've talked a bit about what's going on with the men, what's going on with the women. When the husband was shot down, the casualty affairs officer at the squadron in Vietnam, within hours, would classify the loss as killed in action or missing in action or POW. The policy at the time was you couldn't classify somebody as killed in action unless you had a body, essentially. There are very strict standards. You could have an eyewitness wingman who said he got hit by a surface-to-air missile. It exploded in midair. There was no ejection, no parachute. The plane exploded on the ground in a ball of flame. And they would still classify that as killed, as missing in action because they didn't have a body to reflect it. If the determination was killed in action, the consequences to the wife were immediate. If he was killed in action yesterday at noon, that's when his pay stopped. That's when he stopped being a military member. That's when the wife's pay and benefits stopped. And there would be a one-time, what I thought was a ghoulish term, death gratuity paid to the wife. And at the time it was piddling. But all of a sudden, she was not entitled to the base housing she was in. She was not entitled to the medical care she and her children were getting. And she was never going to get another paycheck. So that was not a good state of affairs over and above the fact that your husband was dead. The MIA was considered a more humane thing for the military to do because he was the flyer was still considered to be alive until proven otherwise, so the pay and benefits continued. It was extremely rare that they would know right away that he had been captured and was alive and was a prisoner, so that almost never happened. So almost by default, MIA was what the wife was told within hours. I mean, usually within days of of the shoot down. Back in the 60s, the policy at the time under the Johnson administration was that the wife was to tell no one of her husband's status. And the rationale was that the North Vietnamese did not want to be politically embarrassed on the world stage. And if word got out that they had prisoners that were being maltreated, the simple solution for them would be to just kill the prisoners and deny they ever had them. So the wives were told, kind of on penalty if you might harm your husband, that they should talk to no one about that. That was a huge problem for the wives because it isolated them from any kind of social support from their peers. They had to lie to their kids. They had to lie to the family. And it was just a terrible situation, which I'll discuss more in the wives session next week. I put this picture in because when the wives were told that their husband was missing in action, many of them were shown this picture. It was not known who this flyer was. 24 different wives identified this photograph as representing their husband. So you can see what a awkward circumstance this was. Over time, the wives situation, the MIA wives situation got worse, as you might imagine. If you're living on base housing after a year or a little bit more, you were expected to move out. At some point, you had to decide when you were going to move your husband's clothes from the clothes closet up to the attic, at which point the kids might say, "Is Daddy dead?" The military, for its part, was not used to having a wife have access to the man's finances and pay records. That was his career, and the wife was not, didn't have authority. And so getting the wives access to military pay and benefits was a process. And I put this slide in here to see if we needed a break, but I don't think we do yet. At least I don't. 1968, peace talks began in Paris, which went on until the end of the war. But meanwhile, back in prison, the men had years and years and years of time on their hands. And one fellow told me they became professional time wasters. You had to do something to avoid brooding about your circumstances, about being depressed, about feeling that the best years of your life were being wasted, that you were not there for your family, and on it went if you didn't do something else with your brain. So there were a few things that allowed you to structure some of the time, that would exercise, hygiene, meals, and prayer, but that left you endless hours to do something with. And one of the men said, everything became an event. Everything became an event. One fellow said it would take him half an hour to decide whether to put on his right shoe first or his left shoe first. You just didn't rush anything. The memory well was when you started remembering things of your own lived experiences. One fellow recalled the name of every student in every class he'd ever been in. One person remembered every verse in the Bible. He then rhymed every verse in the Bible. He then translated every verse in the Bible into French. And he then rhymed every French verse in the Bible. People recalled every movie they'd ever seen, every book they'd ever read. They wouldn't think so much back on family because that was just too painful. So their mind went every other kind of place. The discipline fantasizing was fascinating too. They didn't fantasize about sex. And one fellow said sex was not a priority where we were. But they would do things like build a dream house. And when they built a dream house, having all the time in the world, they would imagine driving around, finding the lot to build it on. They would imagine buying the lot. They would imagine walking to the store to buy the pencils and papers to draw the plans with. They would imagine buying every board of lumber needed. They would imagine hitting every nail to nail in every board, hitting every nail 3 or 4 times as needed until the house was built. And then they would sell that house and use the money to buy a new fantasy house. Or they would build a fantasized airplane. A lot of the men came back and actually built the house in real on their return that they built in their head. Other things that went on, and this is all ways of spending time. Teaching using the tap code was fascinated me. A lot of people had advanced degrees and they would teach through the wall. One to the college level. Men came back from learning things during prison through the wall and tested at the college level when they came back. One fellow learned French through the wall, and he said his vocabulary and sentence structure was great, but his pronunciation left a lot to be desired. People learned math through the walls. They learned history through the walls. And then there was recreation. They actually found ways of playing bridge. And it would take months to complete a game. But they would do it. You had months. They would tell the story of movies that they'd seen. They'd tell jokes. And then one other thing they would do, everybody had a job to do from a military point of view of memorizing. One fellow memorized 250 POW names, men that had been seen alive in the camps at one point. So between one thing and another, they found a way to stay occupied. There are, where to go? Here we go. There are important eras for the POWs in the North. From 1964 to 1972 were what they called the old guy eras. In 1968, Johnson declared a bombing halt, so there were no new POWs in the camp for the next 4 years. So everybody that was there up until 1968 were the old guys. From 1964 to October 69, their treatment of the men was extremely harsh, harsh diet, harsh torture. And then dramatically in October 69, things greatly improved for everybody. And there are differences of opinion as to why that might be. Nixon had been elected and was president, and the POW wives had been pressuring him to go public and criticize the North Vietnamese about the prisoners they were holding. In September, Ho Chi Minh died, and there was probably a radical change in political attitudes about the value of the POWs, political values. Doug Hegdahl came back in May of '69. His is an interesting story. He was a young seaman on a ship offshore that was shelling North Vietnam. And he had been told that it was a dramatic sight at night. So he went up on deck to watch the shelling, and he got knocked overboard by a gun emplacement that swung around and hit him and knocked him over. He was picked up by Vietnamese fishermen and became a prisoner. And he played dumb. He played, I'm just a stupid young enlisted guy. And the Vietnamese didn't prize enlisted people very well, so they pretty much left him alone. And he was a very bright guy, and he became extremely important. He's the guy in the courtyard with the broom that was passing messages using his broom sweeping. And he's the one that memorized 250 names. He did not want to be an early releasee because The order should have been those in prison first, and those who were wounded and injured first before anybody like him got released. But Admiral Stockdale ordered him, military order said that he had to come back and divulge to the American public the degree of abuse of the prisoners, and also the list of names that he had. So that's what he did. And we're not going to talk about that this session. And then the League of Families was established, headed by Sybil Stockdale. And this is pretty much the story that will be told next time. But the women had been quietly organizing and then less quietly organizing. But the League of Families under Sybil Stockdale took a position that they were non-political. They were just advocating for the return of their husbands. They didn't want to be associated with anybody's administration policies. So they were becoming increasingly effective behind the scenes, because the rule still was you couldn't go to the press and you couldn't publicly advocate for fear of doing something that would result in the North Vietnamese taking adverse actions against their husbands. So 69 was a kind of a watershed moment for the men, and things improved happily, not wonderfully, but much better than it was. Then in November, in a rather startling raid, Special Forces went into a camp that was only 40 miles from downtown Hanoi, trying to liberate a number of POWs at this small isolated prison camp at Son Tay. When they got there, it turns out that prisoners, not because they'd been forewarned or anything, but for logistics within the camp system, the prisoners weren't there. So it was not successful from that point of view, but the morale boost, the men in the prison in Hanoi Hilton heard about it, and the morale was boosted, as was the morale of the wives. The Vietnamese were shocked that the raid happened so close to home there, and they moved all of the other prisoners being held in outlying small camps back into the Hanoi Hilton, into this area here, which the men dubbed Camp Unity, and that allowed them to communicate freely, and for the first time, and to see who else was alive. Let's see, let's stay back there. But it was also crowded, and it kind of upended the camp structures from each of the other camps. There had been rank structures and rules, and they varied from camp to camp, and all of a sudden they were thrown together in this mismatch. And while there was a joyful aspect to it, pretty soon they were getting on each other's nerves. The amount of sleeping room allotted to each man sleeping shoulder to shoulder was 2 feet on pallets, and there was a dissension in the ranks, and so the senior commander stepped in and organized it into what was became known as the 4th Allied POW Wing. The 1st, 2nd, and 3rd were honorary from prior wars. And as one POW told me, he said they had everything but a wildlife control officer. Everybody had a duty, and it was trying to stay out of everybody else's nerves. Okay, early releasees, there were 3 or 4 groups of 3 that were released to anti-war groups that came over. And by and large, with the exception of Doug Hegdahl, everybody that went out early was considered to be dishonorable by the men who stayed in the camp. The people who accepted early release were violating a rule that the releases should be sick and wounded first, then enlisted, and then men by date of capture. And anybody who took an early release was considered dishonored. And when the men came back, they made sure that anybody who was still in the service never got promoted again. There were overt collaborators, several enlisted and one or two officers who just by and large didn't agree with the war, and they did collaborate, and they were charged when the prisoners were released. The business about resistance to the requests of the captors to participate in some form of propaganda varied from the hardliners who would resist to the max. Stockdale being an example, when he was pressured to be part of a photo opportunity for an anti-war group, he lacerated his scalp with a razor blade so as to make himself unpresentable, but they patched him up and made him presentable from that. So he smashed his face with a stool and beat himself up to quote, almost unrecognizable, so that he couldn't be used for a photo opportunity. There were, one of the POWs said, you know, one above me on the scale might consider that my resistance was too excessive, and one below me might think it was too ridiculous. One fellow that was musically talented was asked to write a some sort of musical presentation for the camp for the spring festival, and he wrote something that was incredibly obscene, with double entendre and all kinds of references that the Vietnamese would not be familiar with, but it was just massively obscene. And when it was played over the loudspeakers, the POWs were just in hysterics. They were laughing so hard they could hardly see. But the hardliners considered that not a good thing to do, because they considered that the Vietnamese had considered that they had a success and they had participation and cooperation from a POW, and that was considered not a good thing to do. And in terms of awareness of the POWs, in May 1970, a college group came up with the idea of the POW bracelets, and it really caught on. They cost something like 30 cents to make, and they sold them for a couple of bucks, and they became very popular. You know, everybody was wearing them, and it was one way that the POW wives funded some of their activities behind the scene with publications and things that they needed money to do. Interestingly, when the men returned, the bracelets were returned to the man, and one wife, having a whole pile of these bracelets, had them made into a chandelier for the kitchen, which I thought was very creative. Let's see. I've got a break slide. Should we take a break for a little bit?
Okay, it's probably a good idea.
Okay. And when we come back, I'll get to the actual return.
Okay,
Should we call it, what, 10 minutes or what?
Sure. Let's say right after 11 o'clock.
Okay.
So Dick, as you see, we've got over 50 computers on, and of course there are lots of couples on, so it's a really good turnout.
Pretty good, 52, that's great.
I'm glad to hear that.
And are you recording it? I see it is being recorded.
I thought you were.
You know, I must have set it on the automatic mode. I mean, it's recording. I can see it up here. It's just
Okay. Hang on just a second.
Oh, it's in the cloud. That's good. Actually, that's a good. I think I set it up that way.
This is an excellent presentation.
That's great.
Very interesting, very thorough, very informative.
For some reason, my arrow doesn't work, so I can't see who else there.
Right.
You might scroll through. Is your arrow there?
I don't know. I'm still live here, so.
You have an arrow at the side of the pictures. That's right. Why'd you go to
I don't want to mess around with it.
okay. You want to take a break?
No, I don't.
You might say it. I don't have a microphone. It's
Okay.
For the benefit of my family.
Okay. For the benefit of Susan's family, I want to remind them that Susan doesn't have a microphone, so.
I'm thinking of how ill-informed I was of all this while this was going on. Is that true of other people or? No.
I think that the administration was keeping a lid on any information about the POWs. They downplayed it, so it wasn't publicized so much in the early years. And that was one of the reasons the POW bracelet was kind of a breakthrough public awareness kind of move. I certainly wasn't aware of it. Even being in the military, you know, my activities didn't bring me into contact with the POW experience. In fact, my next slide, I'm going to point out that until I got to the School of Aerospace Medicine, which I mentioned what started this, I was blissfully unaware of all of this myself until I got into it. And I was particularly unaware of the wives' side of it because they were going through their own travails, trying to find some leverage to get the POW issue handled in a way that they felt was reasonable. They assumed that the POW issue was on the back burner, and the administration had other things that they were involved with.
There must have been a big level of fear on the point of view of the wives also, that if they said something publicly, that their husband might be treated worse.
Exactly right. Exactly right. Yeah. The Vietnamese would take any public information from America that was adverse, you know, anti-war or whatever, and they would bring it to the POWs and said, well, even your elected representative is against this war. What do you have to say about that? And their reaction was, well, we're over here fighting to make sure they have the right to do that.
Hey, Dick, how did letters get out to go to the wives? Wives. I'm asking.
The men would write a letter and submit it to be sent, forwarded, and then the Vietnamese would read it and they would decide if they wanted to send it or not. So the men would usually try to, well, they were obligated to say something nice about how well they were being treated. They would build some of that kind of verbiage into a long letter that would also have coded messages about something else going on. But they would have to frame it in a way that, gee, the food is great here or something like that, that the Vietnamese would see as having a propaganda plus.
Thank you. Very
And
good.
And the same thing was true for the wives. They would have to not say anything critical or worrisome. And if they included something that might be worrisome, like your mother has cancer or something like that, bad news would be transmitted. But they could put in fake bad news. They could say Aunt Rose broke her hip and can't walk anymore. Well, if there was no such person as Aunt Rose, the POW would not worry about that, you know.
Did they tend to learn Vietnamese?
No, they didn't. Just a few words.
Hmm.
Just a few words. The guards spoke kind of broken English, and some of them were excellent with their English.
I'm wondering how much of an influence this whole way of treating the wives has affected the current military. I know that the military families today are treated with a great deal more respect and more involvement in their husbands' careers or their wives' careers for that matter.
Yeah, that's true. That's evolved. I don't think there was ever a commission that's, said we used to act this way and now we're going to act differently. It's gradually evolved. When I was a physician in the military, it was always a problem, because if the wife or the children had a problem that required attention and time and treatment, you had to stabilize the man's assignment. And the military commanders didn't like that so much. And you could only do it for a certain amount of time before it became a real issue. So it's not a family-friendly organization, but it's better than it was.
Families now, if children in the family need specific care, they have to assure that that's possible in current assignments. So says my son, who is currently in the military.
Yeah, that was a new change and hard one. Yeah, if your child has a specific medical need and it can only be met at certain kinds of bases that are close to a certain kind of treatment facility, that can kind of govern the husband's assignment choices.
So Dick, Mary over here.
Yeah.
Did the North Vietnamese not want the prisoners to know about all the anti-war protests going on in the States?
Oh no, they highlighted those as evidence that you're on the wrong side of history. And they had frequent visitors from anti-war groups, and they wanted the POWs to be part of that. That's, for example, the group that came over with Jane Fonda and Tom Hayden. They would torture the men you've got to be part of that photo opportunity. And the men would do everything they could to not be part of that opportunity. But there would always be foreign press, communist country foreign press that would document the visits by the anti-war groups. And there was always something that the Vietnamese would set up. For example, at Christmas time, they put out a big spread of Christmas food, turkey, and a wonderful looking table. And they photographed the men walking into the room, and as if they were about to partake, and then they ushered them out of the room. and they never got to eat any of it. But there was a propaganda photograph that looked like they were coming into a big, wonderful meal. Should we go back?
Yes.
Okay. So anyway, going back to kind of the chronological timeline, I'm back at the School of Aerospace Medicine for years 2 and 3. I do all the reading on the POW thing. I evolve into the Air Force's expert on prisoners of war. And then I discovered that the Navy Center for Prisoner of War Studies had just started up in a wonderful little place. This is San Diego Bay, and this is Point Loma, and they had a little building out here. And we're setting up their own Center of War, POW Center Studies. And they had an Army social worker, and they had a civilian clinical psychologist, and they had a medical officer, Navy, but he wasn't a flight surgeon. So I went out there to see what they were up to. And one of the first things that struck me was that they were assuming and planning on the men were coming back by ship from the Philippine Islands. And I said, oh, that's tough. It's going to take a couple of weeks. They said they need the time to decompress and to talk to psychologists and stuff like that. And I said, you know, these are pilots, you know, and they didn't have a flight surgeon on their staff, and I was the flight surgeon there. I said, these are pilots. They're not going to sit still for that. And they said, well, they'll do what they're ordered to do. And I said, well, Air Force wise, they didn't volunteer to be medical research subjects, and they're going to want to be on an airplane out of Clark as soon as possible. So we had kind of an immediate culture clash there. And I was to report back to the Pentagon with what I found out from the Navy, the Air Force part of the Pentagon. And that whole idea of bringing them back by ship got rapidly squelched, which didn't improve my status with the Navy Center. We never became exactly a tri-service group. And they were cordial, but not pleased that the men weren't coming back by ship. But basically, the main operation for me was we're going to draft a tri-service medical evaluation protocol. In previous wars, the physicians charged with evaluating the men once they were dispersed and back in the States, didn't know what questions to ask because they didn't know what the men had been through medically and physically and psychologically. So this protocol was to capture, was to put down questions that would capture all of the various things that we knew the men might have experienced, the head trauma and the beatings and the tropical diseases and the nutritional deficiencies. So we ended up with a committee design, tri-service, 400-page medical protocol that the evaluating physicians were expected to fill out when they did their examination. It was taking a long time, let me tell you. It's my first experience with a tri-service committee. Some decisions had already been made at the DoD level that the, I'm calling them here RPWs, repatriated POWs. At that point, they would no longer be POWs. They would be classified as patients and flown out on air evacuation classified aircraft as a way of highlighting the fact this was a humanitarian mission, not a military mission, and a way of avoiding any shenanigans propaganda-wise from the North Vietnamese. The men would get a 3 to 4 day medical evaluation at Clark Air Base, but no families would be allowed at that point. They would be debriefed there, and then once they were cleared medically, they would be transported on home. They would each have a special friend as an escort from start to finish. This would be somebody chosen by them or by their wife as a close friend who would be totally briefed on everything important about the man's family that he would want to know on day one. I lobbied and got permission the physicians on the airplanes flying them out be flight surgeons, not just regular medical doctors, and that there be tri-service, that we have flight surgeons from the Army and the Navy. And so we got that done. This was becoming more and more of a full-time job for me, and I was supposed to still be in my residency training program. That should be 400 pages here, not 48. So it was becoming kind of stressful for me. And then on top of all the running around I was doing, in May of '72, I got orders myself to go to Vietnam, which was considered phase 4 of the residency. So all of my peers got ordered, those of us in the residency. And my boss had a cow. He says, you know what, you can't go. There's just no way. So we appealed my orders all the way up the chain of command, and every level said, nope, it's too bad, Dick has to go to Vietnam, until it got to the Pentagon, and some colonel up there said, you're the only guy who knows what you know, and you're fully involved in that. Anybody can be a dispensary commander in Vietnam, so you don't have to go. But that caused a certain amount of turmoil in my life.
Dick, you were in your early 30s at this point? You were a young guy.
Yeah, 72. I was born in 36. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well,
Look, I was getting up there. Yeah. So back to the chronology. So I dodged that particular bullet and was able to stay involved with the POW program all the way through. In February, this is Valerie Kushner. Her husband was a physician, Army physician, who was a prisoner in the South. And she was a feisty lady. And she was tired of the non-political approach to POW advocacy. So she formed a splinter group away from the League of Families and was more politically active. In fact, she campaigned for McGovern, and I think gave his nominating speech. So that was going on the wives' side of things. Whoops. I have to be careful which button I push. Peace negotiations, Kissinger came out and said, peace is at hand. Oh my gosh, and this was October '72. So there was a big rush to finish this 400-page document. And there was a lot of renewed interest or brand new interest on what are the POWs going to be like. And there was all kinds of speculation by a variety of experts who thought they knew something about POWs. There was speculation that homosexuality in a group setting like this was very common. They would have forgotten how to use a regular toilet. They're going to be psychological wrecks. They're going to be impotent. They're going to be violent. There was one consultant for the DOD who was himself a psychiatrist and a survivor of Auschwitz. And he said, the men are all sick. You have to just count on them being sick. And you have to treat them like patients. And I said, I'm sorry, I respect your experience, but I'm a specialist in pilots, and I don't think they're the same breed of cat that we're talking about and all of these other things. And I'll bet you a six-pack that I'm right and you're wrong, and that they're going to be quite a bit better. He never paid up on that. Well, in December 1972, the peace talks stalled and just came to a complete and utter halt. In response to that, Nixon ordered a massive bombing campaign, 11 days of just carpet bombing the Hanoi area. the POWs in Hanoi Hilton were out in the courtyard cheering. The guards were terrified, and the POWs told them this is the only safe place in Hanoi. 15 B-57s were shot down, which resulted in 31 new prisoners of war. The North Vietnamese ran out of surface-to-air missiles and could not combat the onslaught, and that brought them back to the negotiating table, and the peace talks resumed. So that left a whole new generation that I've commented about of new guys that came down out of the sky into the camp system. They had been told that the war was coming to an end, that they didn't have to worry about anything that they did, any behavior that they did. They could go ahead and be in photo opportunities, that because that would at least let people know that they were there in the camp, that they had survived and were there, that anything they did would be considered done under duress and they would not be punished for it. So they land in the camp, and they are met by Admiral Stockdale. And there was a immediate and profound culture clash with the men saying, the new guys saying, I don't have to behave the way you're talking about. And he says, I'm your commander now. I don't know who you got that from or what, but he's not your commander anymore. I am. And these are the rules in the camp, and you cannot collaborate. So actually the Vietnamese housed the new guys separately from the old guys to kind of keep the dissension at a minimum. So the accord was reached, and the ceasefire was at hand, and that was the first time that we had any inkling of where the guys were going to be released or when. So that allowed us to proceed to Clark Air Base, which is in Manila in the Philippines, which is where we were going to be staging out of Hanoi, fly them from Hanoi to Manila, which is about a 4-hour flight. The planes were set up for 40 POWs per person, per flight, plus their 40 accompaniments. We were told that the Vietnamese could still try propaganda stunts, so that if we took off and we might not be able to land, or if we landed, we might not be able to pick up POWs. In order to make sure that airplane problems would not leave people stranded on the ground, for every plane that took off for the mission, there was an airborne backup and a third plane fully staffed and equipped back on the tarmac in the Clark. We were not going to leave anybody stranded for lack of an airplane. There would be 2 flight surgeons on every plane, 2 nurses initially, and we'll talk a bit more about that. Where am I at here? That's what a C-141 looks like with seats in it. On military aircraft, the seats face backward for improved survivability of crashes. We also had a bunk for everybody. On the day of the mission, the 12th, the nurses brought to me the meal plan. And on the very first meal out of Hanoi, the chef said Spanish rice as one of the choices. And I said, we are not going to feed these guys rice on their first meal coming out of Hanoi. I'm sorry. You go back to the kitchen and tell them to try again. On the actual day of, they brought out one of the trays, and there was a really unappetizing looking slab of gray something or other meat. And I said, you know, it's got to be a little bit more appealing than that. I had tried without success to have some kind of champagne or a beer or something like that available. And the medical authorities above me vetoed that. They felt they might be in too fragile a state nutritionally to let them have a sip of champagne. Boy, did I catch flack for that. We still didn't have a master list of who's going to be on our flight. There were going to be 3 flights the first day. I was on plane number 2. All the lights and cameras were going to be on my airplane. It would be my decision to determine if any of the men aboard would be freaked out by having lights and cameras during the mission. That was because of my expertise in psychiatry. So that was sort of how the mission was set up. We were not allowed to have cameras. And so off we went to Geelong Airport on the 12th of February. We had left the airfield unbombed because of possibly wanting to use it ourselves at the end of the war. So the airfield itself was usable. The structures around it were kind of in sorry shape, but functional anyway. And the way things played out was that the men were driven up in buses, and on their own they would form up in a tight military formation and march up to the processing table, and then one at a time they would be processed out by the Vietnamese and handed over to the Americans, and then picked up by their escort. Where am I at here? There I am. This is General Reisner on the Time magazine cover. The reason he was there was that he was an ace fighter pilot in Korea, and he was also an ace fighter pilot over Vietnam until he got shot down. And the Vietnamese were extremely pleased that they got him because he was famous. And he was the senior, he used to be the senior officer on my aircraft. So here's a brief video that shows the men coming out. There's no sound associated. Here he is with his escort. And briefly, POW narrating. The men came on board, were greeted warmly. This was the first time they had seen women, the nurses, in 6 years. And the feeling was, there's General Reisner. And this is not a typical nurse greeting on an air evacuation flight, but it was an emotional time. The men came up the ramp one at a time. One of the men that came up was a fellow that I had flown with in Nellis Air Force Base. When he saw me at the top of the ramp, he said, "Damn it, Doc, where you been? I've been waiting for 6 years." And I said, "Well, I told you had to make an appointment." So they, despite the circumstances, had a sense of humor still going. They came in and the doors closed at the back of the airplane. And I turned around and they were all standing at their seats, which was totally weird to me. So I had to motion to them to sit down, and they did. The doors closed. There was no emotional reaction. They were just kind of quiet. The engine started up and we started taxiing out. There was still no emotion. I was expecting something. This is without sound. We got to the end of the runway and takeoff power was applied. There was still no emotion. But when the wheels broke the ground, they went nuts. And one of the POWs told me later that things aren't real until they happen. their hopes had been up and down and dashed so many times that they had learned not to be, not to anticipate anything, but to wait until it actually happened to them. And here's the same thing with sound.
I think our sound doesn't come through. There's a,
Oh, it doesn't. Well, shoot.
it's a, there's a setting in there that you'd have to fix. We can talk about it.
Well, they're shouting and happy and all kinds of stuff. So I apologize for the lack of sound. I include this picture here just to prove I was there. That's me right there. But basically, this is what the plane looked like as soon as we were off the ground. It was just mayhem. The men were up talking to each other, hugging everybody. Just a scene of absolute and utter joy. They were particularly enchanted by the nurses. So we had a plane load of 40 guys who hadn't seen women in 6 years and 2 nurses. And they just really wanted to talk to the nurses. And when we got back, I went to the squadron commander that was in charge of the aeromedical nurses. And I said, we need 2 more nurses on every plane. He said, what on earth for? He said, those people are not ill or needing nursing. And I said, no, this is social. The nurses were much in favor of that plan. And we actually got 2 more nurses put on each flight. I put this picture in because there were a few men that we had advanced knowledge might have medical problems, particular medical problems. This fellow here was strongly suspected of having a cardiology problem. So Frank Pettyjohn, who was a flight surgeon and a cardiologist, was on that flight. And I think with the equipment he had on board, he could have done anything up to and including a heart transplant. But it turned out the guy didn't need anything. So that worked out okay. During the flight, there were interchanges that were just wonderful. One fellow was walking down the aisle and all of a sudden started laughing, and he had a pocket full of little metal can opener devices that are part of every aircraft meal for opening some of the cans. They're folding metal things, and he had a pocket full of them. And he said, I was just subconsciously taking them as I walked down the aisle. He said, we were so used to swiping anything that we could steal in camp and using them later. He said, I've got to learn to not do that. So he had a pocket full of those things. One fellow told me that one of the things they missed most being a prisoner was the inability to give gifts to somebody. So he gave me a used package of Vietnamese cigarettes. And he says, this is my gift to you. This is very touching. While I was talking to one other fellow, he all of a sudden burst out laughing, unrelated to our conversation. He said, I'm sorry, Doc. He said, somebody at the back of the plane just said something funny. So he was reacting to somebody sending a tap code message, probably 40 feet away, that he was able to pick up while he was talking to me. It was extremely facile with those communication techniques. I mentioned to one fellow, I said, I suppose you're happy that Nixon ordered the bombing. And the guy looked at me and he said, that could have been done 5 years ago. So I had to be a little bit careful about the politics of what the men thought about things. On a flight that wasn't mine later, one of the escorts brought along a current Playboy magazine, which he showed to the returnee, who had an extreme emotional reaction to it. And at the time he was shot down, the Playboy magazines were more discreet, if I can put it that way. I think the way the British put it, was the naughty parts were hidden. And then by the time he was released, that was not true. And his reaction to seeing the current Playboy centerfold was, oh my God, if things have gone that far south socially, I'm not sure I want to come back. And so he needed some hand holding from a psychological point of view. I elected to not put an A and B photograph in here to show you what he was reacting to. But that was probably the most impressive psychological reaction during the release that we ran into. Partway through the flight, one of the flight attendants came up to me and said, do you know you have a dog? And I said, no, I don't know I have a dog. First, before we get to the dog, this was another nurse providing some support. So anyway, back to the dog. I'll be darned if we didn't have one on board. And I apologize, you know, even though the cameras were on my plane, lights and cameras, there he is. Cute little guy. This is landing at Clark Air Base. But the dog, the man was being marched out of the prison to the bus, and he saw some guards nearby that were going to eat some puppies. So he stepped out of line, went over, grabbed a puppy and stuffed it in his windbreaker and got back in line without any consequence. And he got on the plane, and I'll be darned if we didn't have this puppy. So Clark, the Philippines have very strict rules about rabies and animals and things like that. So I radioed ahead, and the plane was met by a full colonel veterinarian who took the puppy to his home and treated him for all the various things he had and returned him to the POW when he got on the plane to transfer home. The POW got annoyed because every time the plane landed, he was met by another full colonel veterinarian, and the POW said that was better treatment than he got. Well, once we delivered people to the hospital at Clark Air Base, they were in phase 2, and that was not something we had anything involved with. They were immediately had calls home. They were still classified as a hospital patient. They were still not allowed to have a glass of champagne, which really upset them. And they started a rumor that there was a POW, fully stocked POW bar somewhere in the hospital. I think the hospital commander tore that hospital apart 2 or 3 times trying to find the POW bar, but they did it just to object to the policy. They got a complete examination and treatment for things that absolutely had to be treated before they went home. They got a new uniform with rank and ribbons. They got glasses fitted. If they had any urgent dental problems, like a badly rotted tooth, they got extractions right there. And importantly, they got intelligence debriefing. If you had 250 names memorized, you really didn't want to walk around with that and then have a whole bunch of other stuff to think about. So they were debriefed. There were also specially made videos to update them on social and political history that they'd missed, sort of the Rip Van Winkle effect. And they ate. I don't think any of them slept during the 3 or 4 days that they were there. They ate, 6, 8, 12 steaks, a dozen eggs, whatever they could get the cooks. The cooks were just absolutely on call to the men. Whatever they wanted, whatever they asked for, they got. And they took hot showers and tub baths 4 or 5 a day, and they slept in the beds with no apparent difficulty. And they itched to get home. So after their evaluation, they were flown back and usually transited through Travis Air Force Base and then dispersed to the hospitals, military hospital closest to their home. for a complete evaluation before they were released. These were some of the scenes of happiness when the POWs were returning. This is the iconic reunion picture, and it's Bob Sturm being greeted by his family. Bob had been a prisoner for 6 years, and despite what this photograph looks like, when he arrived at Clark Air Base, he was given a letter by the chaplain from his wife saying that she wanted a divorce. So the children think this is a wonderful picture. Bob, not so much. And by his telling, his wife apparently within a year of his capture was seeing other men, and didn't tell the children any of that. And they were divorced within the year of his return. Rather unhappy story. And there were a number of stories that way. On a happier note, Jim came back and checked in the Naval Hospital along with Sybil there. There apparently were no double hospital beds available. So they made a nest of pillows and blankets on the carpeted floor and opened a bottle of champagne. And Sybil later commented that the psychiatrists were wrong about impotence. If you want detailed, good books, this is a book that the POWs themselves endorse as the one book that they think tells the entire story, is immaculately footnoted. This brand new book by Lee is wonderful. For my part, when I came back from Operation Homecoming, I went back to School of Aerospace Medicine, completed my residency, got board certified in aerospace medicine, got appointed to the faculty at the School of Aerospace Medicine, set up a data repository for all of those 400-page documents for the POWs. And I then went through a psychiatric residency on my own and ended up my 20-year career as chief of psychiatry at Travis Air Force Base in California. Next week, we'll focus more on, almost entirely on the wives side of the equation. And there's some time for questions and answers.
Okay. We'll go back to the gallery view so we can see people raising hands if you have questions for Dick. And well, let me ask one. Dick, what was the psychological state of these guys coming out from all of this?
Follow-up studies, they're very low percentage of PTSD relative to the expected. PTSD is a really interesting phenomenon, and we still don't understand it well. But if you expose 100 people to an awful experience, about 30% of them will come away from that with PTSD, but 70% of them do not. And that's not known why, but only 4% of the POWs, the Air Force, the military, the aviators in particular. We don't know about the Army guys. The Army guys kind of dispersed and went away. The Navy had a marvelous follow-up program out of Pensacola where the men were, and their families, were evaluated for years, and maybe still are. The Air Force gradually folded itself into that. We didn't have a follow-up program per se, but only 4% of the flyers ended up with PTSD, and fewer psychiatric diagnoses than a matched group of non-POWs. The divorce rate was significantly higher in the POW group. The difficulty for the father re-establishing a warm relationship with children seemed to be impaired, more so if they'd been in solitary confinement for a long period of time. Seemed to put the father at a disadvantage at developing a warm relationship with his own kids. I had one senior POW that would fly out in his F-111 and talk to me about the fact that his teenage boy had hair down to his shoulders and was disrespectful. And this from a very hard-bitten military father. And I couldn't shake him of the fact that he had to kind of let loose of that. And I think that was true for a lot of the men. They were had a hard time adjusting to the circumstances they came back to.
So there are a few questions on the chat. One is, you had these Rip Van Winkle tapes to show people what had happened. What were their reactions to those tapes?
Questions in the chat room.
Yeah. I'm gonna unplug my earphones so that my wife can also hear.
Yeah.
At least I think I am.
There are some questions in the chat room if you want.
Okay. Am I still being heard?
Yes.
Yes, yes.
I don't know the answer to that question. I think we're a bit overwhelmed. On one of the flights back, one of the POWs was told, well, the winner of the Super Bowl was whatever it was. And the POW says, that's great. What's a Super Bowl?
Mm-hmm.
So there was a lot to be learned. And there was a lot going on at the hospital. And I'm not sure how much time they spent with those tapes.
Ron Seckel, you had a question? Unmute yourself, Ron.
Hi, Richard. A great presentation. I just got back from a committee meeting. I had to leave in the middle, and I missed some of it, but I'm thrilled to be back. And I just wanted to ask you a question. I got very interested. I was in the Navy at the time on the USS Camden AOE-2 off of the coast of Vietnam. And when I left the Navy, I got very interested in what was called the last POW, Bobby Garwood.
Yeah.
And I was just wondering if you knew anything about that story.
I know a little bit. He alleged to have knowledge of Americans still being held in Vietnam or Laos or Cambodia. He's been widely discredited as a historian. He wrote a book about his own experience and never mentioned that he knew anything about other Americans. So I haven't spent a whole lot of time figuring out more about the Garwood story.
In the chat, somebody asked if they were correct in remembering that John McCain had lifelong problems with his arm, the arm that was broken, and how many pilots had similar issues, long-term health problems.
Yeah, he did. I don't think he could even comb his own hair. They didn't set the bones properly. They just kind of plastered them in the direction they found them. So yeah, he had a problem. Stockdale had problems that prevented him walking without a cane. So yes, a lot of the men had limitations that prevented them. A lot of them wanted to go back to flying status. And in the Air Force, to be on flying status, you had to be physically qualified to fly anything in the inventory. So you couldn't have little minor problems. The Navy was more accommodating, and they would try to, for example, if you're a fully trained pilot, you've got all those millions of dollars invested in it. They would try to find a plane that he could fly and flying status that would allow him to continue flying.
You want to say something about our experience going back?
Okay, other questions here.
Mary,
Yep.
Dick, it seems that at least until about a decade ago, that so many of our homeless people were known to be, or supposedly known to be, Vietnam vets. Was that the case? You dealt mostly with pilots, is that correct?
I didn't deal with the
And
veterans.
that would,
Yeah, I didn't deal with the veterans population so much, except I worked at the VA and definitely worked with them there. Yeah, the combat veterans came back from Vietnam with PTSD, and that was not a regular diagnosis until 1970 within the psychiatric nomenclature. It was controversial because PTSD was the first psychiatric diagnosis that was imposed on a person by outside forces. And there was resistance within the psychiatric community to admitting that that was possible. But the vets came back and they said, you know, damn it, we're broken. And that nobody in the VA knew what the problem was and they didn't know how to fix it until PTSD emerged as the problem, and we're still working on how to fix it. It's a fascinating psychological issue. The most riveting feature of it is the flashback. And I talked to a Korean War POW who was out getting some groceries at 7-Eleven one night. And as he was driving out of the parking lot, he flashed back to being in Korea, being in a military vehicle, and there were 3 Koreans in front of him. So he gunned the car and tried to run them down. At the very last instant, he recognized that it was a young Asian couple and their child. And he was able to avoid them. But the fact that they were Asian was his trigger to a flashback to the combat scenario. And he said, you don't know what it's like to not be able to trust your brain. And he said, what would a jury have done with that?
Wow.
So he was essentially housebound because there were so many things that triggered him that he couldn't go out and negotiate life anymore.
Ron? Ron?
Yeah, I was just wondering, it sounds like you've had many wonderful conversations with POWs. Do you still, are you in contact with any of them at this point?
No.
About the Reisner thing.
No. We went to, Susan and I went to a demonstration that highlighted the successes of some of the POWs. You know, many of them became politicians and businessmen. And this was up at the Marines Memorial in San Francisco. And while we were standing around talking to the people that were there, one of the POWs came up and said, oh my God, you're Dick Hancey, Doc Hancey. And he said, General Reisner talks a lot about how you helped him. He was the guy that flew in from time to time in his F-111 to have a little chat with me. So, but long term, I felt it was their story. That's why I haven't told this very often. It's the POWs, and they just as soon not have a spotlight shown on them. And they wanted to get on with the rest of their lives. And I respect that. One of the POWs gave a talk once, and about all the things he had conquered while a POW. Somebody in the audience says, well, it sounds like you came out a better person than when you went in. And his reaction was, yeah, but it's a hell of a way to get healthy.
Somebody asked, were the prisoners beaten?
Oh, Lord, yes. I think Stockdale had his leg broken twice. You know, they were beaten viciously about the engineers. One of the problems medically evaluating people for flying in the Air Force is if you've ever been unconscious for more than once from a head injury, you're disqualified for flying. And a lot of these guys were, you know, knocked unconscious repeatedly over the years. So yeah, there were various forms of beatings and tortures, yeah. Waterboarding, you know, some of the things that are arguable, it always annoyed me that we had returned POWs in Congress that could speak to the issue of what is and what is not torture. And we had other people say, well, it's just enhanced interrogation. No, waterboarding is torture. Solitary confinement is torture. And there's no getting around it if you're the torturee, you know.
Other questions for, okay, Ron has another one.
So many of them were in there so many years, especially the old timers. Did they keep getting promoted while they were prisoners?
They did. They did. They kept getting pay raises and promotions. And so the uniforms that were waiting for them had their current rank, their appropriate new rank. Yeah. And most of them didn't know that, you know, what they were. Coming back was a real problem because, you know, if you're a fighter pilot like General Reisner, you kind of expect to rise up through the ranks and be commander of a base, a fighter base. That depends on your experience in doing what you've been doing. And if you've been out of the running for 6 years, you're going to be just, by virtue of your rank, you're going to displace somebody who's more experienced than you are. And it was an awkward situation. So a lot of the men went back through advanced education opportunities, getting degrees, and then came back in careers that were kind of tailored for them and didn't displace anybody who'd come right up through the ranks and deserved the position.
In the prisons, did they have any reading material, paper, pencils, anything like that?
No reading material. Well, yeah, they had propaganda. Yeah, they were frequently told to read propaganda, which reminds me of an interesting communication story. One of the POWs in a letter saying, you should read Chairman Mao's Red Book, page 79, particularly interesting. And that letter got back and was interpreted by the intelligence community as representing being brainwashed. Nobody went to read Chairman Mao's book, page 79. And what it was describing was when Chairman Mao was himself a political prisoner, he made an ink out of ground up rice that when you write in the margins of a letter, it's invisible. And the person who got the letter would use an iodine solution to make the writing visible. So this POW was telling him that he's writing messages in his letters using rice ink. Nobody ever thought to read what he recommended reading. And he was furious when he got that. But other than that, no, they didn't have any. They would steal toilet paper, and they would make quill pens out of straws from brooms, and they would concoct ink out of soot from various places. So they would write little things. I think they made, for example, decks of cards out of toilet paper, little teeny tiny things that they could hide and play bridge with.
I thought one of the surprising things to me was the policy towards men, the wives of men killed in action. I mean, that just seems so against the military's taking care of their own. Well, do you know why it was such a terrible policy, and has it changed now?
Well, back then, wives were considered by the military to be an inconvenience. And, you know, if the Army wanted you to have a wife, they'd have issued you one. So it was just a lack of sensitivity and a basically male chauvinist organization, male-oriented, male-dominated. And they weren't prepared to take it into accommodation. And I think as women asserted themselves, they were became less willing to be considered as second-class citizens, and their husbands were, more defensive of the needs of the family over time. But it was a slow shift, let me tell you.
Ron?
When I was in the service, I was single, and I do remember the importance of having a wife. And after I got out of the military and I found my wonderful, wonderful spouse, I said, had I stayed in, I could have made admiral with her.
Well,
Okay, he just said that because I'm in the room.
well, the wife I had at the time I was in the military was one of the several reasons I never made general. She considered it to be my career, and she had other things to do. So she was not into putting on white gloves and leaving cards on silver trays. Well, I appreciate being able to talk to you about this. It certainly shaped my professional career. It got me over into psychiatry and doing things that I never expected to do. And I look forward to talking about the wives' side next time.
Look forward to hearing it.
So that was very well done, Dick. And we'll
Very much.
everybody that, so 1 week from today, and the link that you got last time will work again next week. We will send you another notice also. And somebody asked about the recording. We'll probably pretty quickly, within a couple of days, put the recording on the OLI website. There's a list of OLI courses, and you'll be able to see it there if you missed part of it.
Wonderful.
Thank you, Barry.
Okay, thanks a lot, Barry.
Thank you, Richard.
Okay,
And you, Barry.
bye, everybody.
Right.
Bye.